In November 1983, the world came terrifyingly close to ending, and almost nobody knew. I'm not talking about a movie or some secret Cold War conspiracy theory. This actually happened. NATO ran a routine military exercise, just another drill. But to the Soviet Union, it looked exactly like the start of a nuclear war. Think about that. Both sides armed to the teeth with nukes, both terrified the other might strike first, and one simple misunderstanding almost pulled the trigger. And here's the crazy part. This wasn't the 1960s. It wasn't during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the 80s, when people thought the Cold War was cooling down. So what went wrong? How did a fake war almost become the real thing? And why was the world only one radar glitch away from Armageddon? Today we're diving into the story of Able Archer 83, the military drill that almost started World War III. Imagine this. You wake up one morning in November 1983, and the world feels tense. You don't know it yet, but right now the most powerful nations on Earth are quietly preparing for what could have been the end of civilization. I know that sounds dramatic, but this isn't some movie plot or a wild theory from Reddit. This actually happened. The United States and its NATO allies were running what they thought was just another military exercise, a yearly drill, something they'd done before. Codename, Able Archer 83. But here's the twist. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union wasn't laughing. To them, this exercise looked way too real. They thought the West was hiding a real nuclear strike behind the disguise of a drill. Let that sink in for a second. One side thought they were pretending to go to war. The other side thought they were actually going to war. Missiles on both sides, warheads ready, and no one really sure what the other was thinking. All it would have taken was one bad reading on a radar screen, one nervous commander, one misunderstood message, and the world as we know it could have ended, all because of a misunderstanding. The scariest part? Hardly anyone outside a handful of officials even realized how close we came. No news broadcasts, no presidential addresses, no duck and cover warnings, just quiet panic behind closed doors. This wasn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was the 1980s, a decade of pop music, personal computers, and nuclear weapons still pointed at every major city on Earth. So what happened? How did a simple war game push us to the edge of Armageddon? And why did the Soviet Union think NATO was about to pull the trigger for real? Stick around, because once you hear what went down during Able Archer 83, you'll realize how insanely lucky we were to make it out of that week alive. To really understand how Able Archer 83 almost turned into the end of the world, we need to rewind a little to 1983. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Cold War? That's old school spy stuff. James Bond, secret agents, and nuclear drills, right? But 1983 wasn't some quiet chapter in history. It was one of the tensest years since the 1960s, and the world was on edge, even if people didn't realize just how close to disaster they were. Let me paint the picture for you. The President of the United States was Ronald Reagan, the kind of leader who didn't mince words. Earlier that year, he'd stood on stage and called the Soviet Union the evil empire. To the West, it was a catchy political line, but in Moscow, it sounded like a declaration that the Americans were gearing up for a fight. Around the same time, the U.S. was rolling out new Pershing II missiles in Europe. Sleek, and deadly. These things could hit Moscow in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Imagine sitting in a control room in the Kremlin, watching your biggest enemy install missiles that can reach your capital before you can even finish your morning coffee. You'd probably be nervous too. And then came September, the same year. A civilian airliner, Korean Air Flight 007, accidentally wandered into Soviet airspace. The Soviets, already on high alert, panicked. They shot it down. 269 innocent people were killed. The world was horrified. But inside the Soviet Union, leaders like Yuri Andropov, the aging, paranoid former head of the KGB, thought this tragedy was proof that the West was testing them, probing their defenses, maybe preparing for a surprise nuclear strike. You've got to remember, these were men who'd lived through World War II, who'd seen their country invaded and nearly destroyed. So when Reagan started talking tough, and NATO began running large-scale military drills right near their borders. They didn't see it as routine. They saw it as a possible prelude to invasion. And to make things even worse, the Soviets were practically blind. Their technology lagged behind the West's. Their early warning systems were glitchy, and their spies were under pressure to bring back any sign, any hint, that the U.S. was preparing a nuclear strike. They even had an operation for it, codenamed Ryan. The mission? Detect the earliest warning of an American attack, no matter how small the clue. Think about the paranoia that creates. Every cargo plane, every military convoy, every unusual radio transmission, it could all be a sign that doomsday was about to begin. So by late 1983, the stage was set. A U.S. president calling out the Soviets in public, missiles in Europe that could reach Moscow in minutes. A Soviet leadership old, sick, and convinced they were running out of time. Both sides armed to the teeth, both terrified of being caught off guard. All it needed was one spark. And that spark came in November, in the form of a NATO exercise that was supposed to be just another routine drill. But to the Soviets, it looked like the countdown to nuclear war. All right, so by November 1983, the world is a powder keg. Both superpowers are on edge. And right in the middle of all this tension, NATO decides to run its annual war game, just a drill. Nothing unusual, they did it every year. The name? Able Archer 83. On paper, it was a routine training exercise, the kind where officers sit in command centers and practice how they'd respond if the Soviets ever launched a nuclear attack. It wasn't real combat, no troops storming the fields, no bombs dropping, just phones ringing, maps lighting up, encoded messages flying across NATO's communication lines. But this time, things were different. See, 1983 wasn't just another year, and NATO decided to make this exercise extra realistic. New communication systems were used. Actual heads of government were involved for the first time. Even the message traffic, the secret radio signals between command centers, was sent in a way that perfectly mimicked how a real nuclear launch would happen. Usually during these drills, everyone knows it's fake. The codes are obviously made up. The chatter feels routine. But Able Archer 83 broke that pattern. NATO officers went silent on certain channels, switched to encrypted frequencies, and started transmitting what looked, from the outside, like genuine wartime communications. In simple terms, they stopped pretending it was a game. NATO forces were role-playing a full-scale escalation, starting from a conventional war and ending in simulated nuclear release procedures. It followed a script. Day by day, they would react to fictional Soviet aggression. The final stage, testing how NATO's command would request permission to launch nuclear weapons if things ever reached that point. And remember, from the Soviet perspective, this was happening right on their doorstep. NATO air bases across Western Europe were buzzing with activity, radar stations lighting up, planes moving around, coded transmissions flying through the air. To the west, it was business as usual. To the east, it looked like NATO was going from training to launching. Think about it like this. Imagine you're watching your neighbor's house, and suddenly you see them moving boxes labeled ammunition, locking their doors, and whispering in radios. You'd think, wait, are they planning something? That's exactly what it looked like to the Soviets. Inside NATO, no one had any clue that Moscow was interpreting this exercise as a possible cover for a real nuclear attack. To them, it was just another week of running scenarios and checking procedures. But to Soviet intelligence, all the red flags were flashing. Their analysts were watching the number of NATO communication signals spike. They saw the sudden radio silence in certain channels. They noted the movement of key NATO officials. And worst of all, they believed these were the exact signs that would come right before an actual strike. Meanwhile, inside Western command rooms, officers were sitting at long tables, following scripts. Enemy forces advancing. Request nuclear release authorization. They were reading these lines like part of a drill, not realizing that at the same moment, Soviet radar stations were bracing for what they thought might be the real deal. The more realistic NATO made Able Archer, the more suspicious the Soviets became. It was like a scene from a thriller where both sides are misreading each other, one rehearsing, the other panicking, and neither side knows how dangerously close they are to making the ultimate mistake. And as the exercise went on, the tension didn't fade. It escalated. Because behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviets weren't just watching anymore. They were starting to react. While NATO commanders were busy running their pretend war, something very real was happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Inside the Soviet Union, alarms were quietly going off. Not the loud, blaring kind you hear in movies, but the kind that echo in underground bunkers in cold, fluorescent-lit command rooms. Remember, Moscow was already on edge. They had an intelligence operation in place called Ryan. Its job was simple but terrifying: to spot the earliest signs of a Western nuclear first strike. Soviet leaders were obsessed with the idea that the U.S. might strike first and try to wipe them out before they could even respond. So when Able Archer 83 began, the KGB and the GRU, that's Soviet military intelligence, started feeding back reports to Moscow. Increased NATO communications, strange military movements, and the participation of top Western officials. To them, this was the exact checklist of what a nuclear attack would look like. The data lined up too perfectly. In their minds, NATO wasn't simulating a nuclear war. It was preparing to launch one. Think about it from their perspective. Every year, NATO ran these drills, but this one suddenly had high-ranking government figures involved. The radio traffic looked real. The codes were different. There was silence on certain frequencies. And to Soviet ears, silence was even more suspicious than noise. Within hours, Soviet military units in Eastern Europe were put on alert. Their air bases in East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia began quietly prepping bombers. Nuclear warheads were reportedly moved to readiness positions. It wasn't official wartime posture yet, but it was dangerously close. At one Soviet base, crews reportedly sat in their cockpits, engines idling, waiting for a possible launch order that, thankfully, never came. Meanwhile, in Moscow, General Secretary Yuri Andropov, already sick and deeply paranoid, was convinced the Americans were trying to trick them. He thought this exercise might be the perfect cover for a surprise first strike. He told his inner circle, "We may be about to be attacked." Think about that for a second. One man sitting in a Kremlin office, surrounded by maps and aging generals, believing that at any moment the U.S. might push the button. And because the Soviets had seen surprise attacks before, Hitler's invasion of 1941 still haunted them, they didn't want to be caught off guard ever again. The fear was deep, personal, almost instinctive. So they did what humans do when they're scared. They prepared for the worst. Intelligence officers scrambled to collect more proof. Spies in Western Europe sent coded messages to Moscow. Activity at NATO bases is increasing. Military command posts ran constant simulations. Submarine commanders were told to be ready for immediate orders. And yet, no one in the West had any clue that this was happening. NATO leaders were still sitting in meeting rooms, discussing imaginary scenarios, completely unaware that their every move was being misinterpreted as real. To the Soviets, this was the moment before the storm, the calm before the first flashes of nuclear fire. Even some Soviet officers reportedly thought, if the West doesn't stop this exercise soon, we'll have no choice but to respond. The line between simulation and reality had completely blurred. Picture this: two armed men standing in the dark, each convinced the other is about to shoot first. Neither wants to start it, but both are terrified of waiting too long. That's exactly what November 1983 felt like. And while NATO continued its war game, the Soviets began quietly loading their own. Missiles were moved, bombers were fueled, fingers were getting dangerously close to launch keys. All it would have taken was a single false alarm, a misread radar blip, a confused radio operator, and the Cold War would have gone hot. But somehow, that launch order never came. And that's where the story turns. Because next, the tension hits its peak. How close did the world really come to nuclear war? By early November 1983, the world had no idea it was standing just inches away from nuclear war. The missiles weren't flying, but the atmosphere was electric. a mix of paranoia, fear, and complete misunderstanding. NATO was still running its exercise. Able Archer 83, just a simulation, remember? But to the Soviets, every single move looked more and more like the real thing. They were watching radar screenings light up, intercepting radio chatter that sounded authentic, and observing American bombers practicing nuclear launches. But the Soviets didn't see practice. They saw preparation. And the truly terrifying part? They had no way of knowing otherwise. Behind closed doors, Soviet military units across Eastern Europe were ordered to full readiness. Nuclear warheads were reportedly moved closer to delivery aircraft. Bomber crews sat on standby, engines fueled and humming, waiting for orders that could come at any moment. It was like watching a line of dominoes wobble. All it needed was the smallest nudge to send them crashing down. In one chilling report from the time, U.S. intelligence later discovered that Soviet commanders actually placed nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland on high alert. These weren't just empty threats. These were weapons ready to go. And on the other side, NATO officers had no clue that their imaginary game was being taken so literally. The West thought they were playing chess. The Soviets thought they were about to be checkmated. That's what makes this so haunting. It wasn't aggression that nearly doomed the world. It was miscommunication. Now imagine this. Deep in a Soviet bunker, a radar officer sees strange flight paths forming over Western Europe. He's trained to expect the unexpected. His commander tells him, "Stay sharp. If they launch, we must respond immediately." Thousands of miles away, NATO officers are casually wrapping up their drills, completely unaware that someone's finger is hovering over a nuclear launch key, waiting for one misunderstood signal. One mistake, a false alarm, a mistranslated code, a broken radio, could have turned this exercise into Armageddon. And this wasn't just theoretical fear. The Soviets had reason to be paranoid. Only a few months earlier, they'd shot down a Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 007, after mistaking it for a U.S. spy plane. That tragedy had already shaken them. They believed the West was probing their defenses, testing how far they could push. So when NATO began simulating nuclear readiness drills, complete with coded messages, mock war orders, and realistic flight patterns, the Soviets thought, this is it. They're coming for us. And here's the horrifying truth. No one was talking. There were no emergency hotlines ringing between Washington and Moscow saying, hey, relax, it's just an exercise. The U.S. didn't realize the Soviets were panicking, and the Soviets didn't know it was all make-believe. Think about that. The two most powerful nations on Earth, both armed to the teeth with thousands of nuclear weapons, standing on opposite sides of a foggy misunderstanding, each waiting for the other to blink first. Inside the Kremlin, Yuri Andropov's paranoia was reaching its peak. He reportedly refused to leave his secure command post, fearing a surprise strike. His health was failing, but his fear was sharp. He told aides, "They are preparing to attack us." Every report coming in seemed to confirm his fears. Even the smallest NATO move, a change in radio silence, a coded message, a false reading, looked like the spark before the explosion. And yet, somehow no one pushed the button. Whether it was hesitation, confusion, or sheer luck, the moment passed. The exercise ended on November 11, 1983. Slowly, NATO forces stood down. The world, without even realizing it, had just stepped back from the edge of nuclear annihilation. But here's what makes it even more terrifying. The U.S. didn't find out how close they'd come until years later. When Western intelligence analysts reviewed Soviet communications, they realized this wasn't paranoia. The Soviets had genuinely believed a nuclear attack was imminent. President Reagan himself was shocked. He later wrote in his diary that the Soviets really were afraid of us, and that realization changed him. It made him rethink everything about the arms race. That's how close we got, not because someone wanted war, but because both sides were so afraid of being destroyed that they almost destroyed each other. In the end, Able Archer didn't just test NATO's command systems, it tested humanity's luck. And somehow we passed barely. And just like that, the exercise ended. November 11th, 1983, NATO's Able Archer drill wrapped up quietly, just as it was supposed to. No missiles launched, no alerts went off, no orders to retaliate. But on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the tension didn't fade immediately. Soviet officers who'd spent the past week holding their breath finally stood down. The orders to ready nuclear aircraft were pulled back. Command bunkers powered down. And for the first time in days, the world exhaled. But here's the eerie part. Nobody in the West realized what had almost happened. To NATO officials, Able Archer was just another successful training simulation. They packed up their papers, shut down the comms, and went home for the weekend. No one, not a single person in that command room, knew that for several days the Soviets had been on hair-trigger alert, convinced the end was coming. There was no breaking news headline, no presidential speech about a close call, nothing. The most dangerous week of the Cold War came and went, in total silence. Years later, when declassified intelligence reports started trickling out, U.S. officials were stunned. Analysts reviewing Soviet communications and satellite data realized the truth. The Soviets had genuinely believed NATO was preparing to launch a nuclear strike. They weren't bluffing. They weren't pretending. They were scared. And this was what shook Washington to its core. President Ronald Reagan, when he was finally briefed, couldn't believe it. In his diary, he wrote something simple but powerful. "I don't see how they could believe that, but it's clear they did." And that's scary. That single sentence says everything. For the first time, the United States realized how deep Soviet fear really went, how much distrust and paranoia had poisoned their worldview. The Soviets weren't trying to start a war. They were trying to survive when they thought was already coming. And that's the real tragedy of it all. This wasn't about aggression or ideology. It was about fear. Two superpowers, both terrified of the other's intentions, both stockpiling enough nuclear weapons to end life on Earth 10 times over, both too scared to blink first. The moment passed, not because of diplomacy, not because of clever strategy, but because of luck. Pure, fragile luck. If one radar technician had panicked, if one commander had misread a code, if one leader had lost his nerve, we wouldn't be here to tell this story. But somehow the world kept spinning. The phones stayed quiet, and the apocalypse that nearly began as a military exercise ended as a footnote, one we didn't even notice until years later. Able Archer 83 became a legend whispered among historians and intelligence officers. Proof that sometimes the closest we ever come to disaster is when no one even realizes it's happening. For years, Able Archer 83 was just another Cold War drill buried in NATO's archives. On paper, nothing had gone wrong. No shots fired, no alarms triggered, no diplomatic fallout. To everyone involved, it was just another week of training, mission accomplished. But what nobody knew was that behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviets had been holding their breath the entire time. That terrifying truth didn't come out until years later. In the late 1980s, as the Cold War finally began to thaw, American intelligence agencies started reviewing classified Soviet files and intercepts. That's when the pieces started falling into place, and what they found left officials stunned. Analysts discovered that during Able Archer, Soviet military units across Eastern Europe were on maximum alert. Their nuclear bombers had been moved to forward positions. Missiles were armed and ready to launch, and command bunkers were fully manned. In simple terms, they were seconds away from preparing for nuclear retaliation. And they weren't pretending. This wasn't propaganda or posturing. This was real fear. When the CIA and later NATO intelligence reviewed the data, they realized something chilling. The Soviets truly believed the United States and its allies were about to launch a first strike. For years, Washington had assumed that the USSR was always calculating and cautious. But this time, they'd been terrified. President Ronald Reagan was briefed on the findings, and he was visibly shaken. In his private diary, he wrote, "I feel the Soviets are so paranoid about us, it's frightening." Imagine that. The leader of the most powerful nation on Earth realizing that his rival hadn't been plotting war. They'd been trying to survive one they thought was already on its way. This revelation changed everything. For Reagan, it was a wake-up call. Up until then, he'd viewed the Soviet Union as an evil empire, a dangerous adversary that needed to be contained and outspent. But now he began to see them differently, not just as enemies, but as human beings living under the constant fear of annihilation. Historians believe that this realization played a major role in shifting Reagan's attitude in the later years of his presidency. You can see it in the timeline. Soon after this period, he pushed harder for dialogue with Soviet leaders. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, Reagan didn't meet him with hostility. He met him with hope. The Reykjavik summit, the eventual INF treaty that reduced nuclear weapons on both sides, all of that had roots in the lessons of Abel Archer. Because Reagan finally understood something simple but powerful. Fear can be more dangerous than hatred, and misunderstanding can be deadlier than intent. He even said it himself in later speeches, that peace wasn't about weapons, it was about communication, about making sure that both sides knew the other didn't want to start a war by accident. Meanwhile, the Soviet side was quietly shaken too. Their own officers admitted that the system, this web of mistrust, paranoia, and worst-case thinking, had nearly killed them all. One former Soviet general later described it as a moment when we looked into the abyss and the abyss looked back. That's not poetry, that's history. The terrifying near miss of Abel Archer 83 became a quiet lesson for both sides, a warning carved into history. Sometimes the greatest threat to humanity isn't a bomb, a missile, or a warhead. It's the fear of what the other side might do. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? The fact that a simple military exercise, something that was never meant to be more than a test, could have brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. No bombs fell, no alarms screamed, and yet for a few days in November 1983, humanity stood one decision, one misread signal, one trembling hand away from total annihilation. And the wildest part? Nobody knew, not the press, not the public, not even most of the people running the exercise. The world nearly ended, quietly. When you think about that, it makes you realize how fragile peace really is. We like to believe that global conflicts only happen through big, obvious events, invasions, declarations, treaties. But history shows us that sometimes it's not hate that brings us to the edge. It's fear. Fear of what the other side might do, fear of being caught off guard, fear of blinking first. Abel Archer 83 wasn't just a near disaster. It was a mirror, reflecting how paranoia can almost destroy the very thing we're trying to protect. And in a strange way, it taught the world something vital. It showed that communication isn't just a diplomatic nicety, it's survival. When Reagan finally understood how afraid the Soviets really were, it changed him. He began to see that peace couldn't be built on fear. It had to be built on understanding. That shift, that human moment, is what opened the door to the arms control treaties, to the thaw of the Cold War, to the eventual fall of the Berlin Wall. It all traces back in some small but powerful way to the week when the world almost ended and then quietly kept going. And that's the lesson Abel Archer 83 leaves behind. That sometimes our greatest danger isn't the enemy we see, as in, it's the story we tell ourselves about them. It's the assumptions, the misunderstandings, the belief that we already know what they're planning. Because when both sides live in fear of each other, it doesn't take evil to start a war. It just takes a mistake. So the next time you hear about rising tensions, new rivalries, or military exercises that sound too real, remember this story. Remember how close we came once upon a time, simply because neither side wanted to die first. Abel Archer reminds us that peace isn't automatic. It's something we have to keep earning through empathy, honesty, and a little bit of luck. And maybe that's the scariest truth of all. The fate of the world doesn't rest on weapons or presidents or armies. It rests on understanding.